And a very warm welcome to Winter Tales, where we're celebrating 175 years of New College, the building New College. And it's a delight to be able to introduce Sally Magnusson. Sally needs very little introduction as one of Scotland's leading broadcasters, novelists, and biographers. Sally, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, pleasure.
And before we move into conversation, I'm required to say a few housekeeping things. Firstly, thank you so much, everyone, for continuing to follow government and university guidance about wearing your masks and maintaining social distancing. Thanks for doing that. We're not planning on these surprises, such as a fire alarm. So if you do hear a fire alarm, it's probably for real. So look out for the white and green signs and go out of those doors. And also, do stay on afterwards. There's some more drinks, tea, coffee afterwards, and also an opportunity to meet Sally and to sign some books. Well, you don't have to sign the books. Maybe Sally could write the books, so that's all right. Okay, the way we're going to structure this evening's conversation is around three of Sally's books, two novels and one biography. And the first one that we'll be talking about, you can see just behind me, is The Sealwoman's Gift. But before we do that, perhaps if we could just place the conversation, because I'm fascinated how you're really interested by place, in the place that we're in now. In Edinburgh, this rich literary city, full of memories of writers and of books. What would you say is your first literary memory of Edinburgh?
No idea.
None at all.
I can't remember my first literary memory, to be honest. But I came to Edinburgh University to study English literature. So my memories of Edinburgh, curiously, are very literary in the broadest sense, if you like. I mean, lying the grass outside Pollock Halls, reading James Joyce, sort of thing. But my first, no idea. Sorry.
That's okay. No. As a child, do you remember being captivated by hearing stories or reading stories? Both. I think it was a household that was very keen on stories in the very broadest sense. My parents were both newspaper journalists. My mother had stopped working, in a newspaper office when she was married, as women had to do at that time. But she still wrote columns from home, and my father was writing articles for the Daily Express, the Scotsman. So talk about stories. That's a great story. I got this story before anybody else, and my mother talking about the great sort of daring do of journalism in the 50s. Hopping in and out of helicopters as they did. They had money in these days, and they were chasing stories all the time. So I grew up with this idea of the journalistic story, which is much more interesting than it was by the time I started and went to work on the very douce Scotsman. But there was also my father translating the Icelandic sagas, which he was doing at the same time. So I was hearing saga stories. I was hearing my mother's anecdotes, and I was reading. Enid Blyton and the horsey fare of young girls at that time, and so both, but lots of stories, yeah. Shall we go to The Sealwoman's Gift, your first novel? Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in, and you were talking about the sagas there that your father told and recounted and told you about, of why you brought together this story, in the 17th century, why you brought together stories from Iceland with a story with Algiers. Because that was the story. I mean, the story was, and it was one I knew of because I was visiting Iceland all my life, and it was a story that had imprinted itself onto the Icelandic psyche. So traumatic was the experience of having lost 400 of their citizens at a time when Iceland's population, I mean, even today it's only got 350,000 people. It was a lot smaller in 1627. And pirates arrived from Algiers. They were marauding at that time, these North African pirates licensed by the Regency states of, Algiers and Tripoli, Morocco, but mainly Algiers. Algiers was the main one, and they were licensed to go out and to bring back slaves, and they went all around the Mediterranean, and they came to Britain. They pillaged people from Cornwall and Devon, Scottish mariners. They didn't actually come to the coast of Scotland, but they would take ships, Scottish ships, and they took the people back to Algiers. And Iceland was the furthest north that they ever managed to get. 1627, they arrived. The Icelanders called them the Turks. It was called the Turkish raids, and they just went along the coast of Iceland and the coast of the little Westman Islands to the south of Iceland, and they brought their galleons in, and they just ran amok over the Westman Islands, and they took all these people and bundled them into their ships, took them back to Algiers, where they were sold into slavery. And the story that I have followed is the one connected to a pastor on the Westman Islands called Ólafur Egilsson, who was married to a woman called Ásta Thorsteinsdóttir, and they and their family were abducted in this raid, taken back to Algiers with their children. She gave birth in the ship, which was the thing that caught my imagination. Oliver wrote a memoir about it, and he managed to dispense with the labour and birth in half a sentence. And I thought, hey up, well, how very interesting it would be to see this from Ásta's point of view rather than Oliver's. And they got to Algiers, they were separated. She was taken to a big, fine house, and he was eventually, and it's not a complete spoiler because it happens fairly early on, he was sent back to Denmark, the colonial head of Iceland, to try and get a ransom. And so in answer to your question, why did I bring Algiers and Iceland together? I brought them together because that's where the Icelanders were taken historically, and it was just such a good and terrible story. And the reason I wrote it was that I had written the non-fiction book Where Memories Go, the memoir about my mother that we'll maybe talk about later. And my editor said, what story do you want to write now? And I couldn't really think of anything that I wanted to write. And she said, well, just tell me some of the stories. What are you reading just now? What are you thinking? What are you wanting to... And I said, well, I've just read a translation of this wonderful memoir by Ólafur Egilsson, 17th century pastor in Iceland, about the Turkish raid. She said, what's that? What's that? And so I told her the story, and she said, well, write it. I want. That's what I want. Write that one. And I said, no, I can't. I can't write a history of this complexity. And there's so many different languages involved, and I'd probably have to go to a library in Istanbul, and no, thank you. And she said, well, write it as fiction then. And I thought, ooh. And that's how it became.
One of the things that gripped me about the story, apart from the story itself, was the sense of place, the contrasting place between the world of Iceland and the world of Algiers. I'm just wondering, was that through your imagination? You imagined those spaces, or was it through your own journeys and exploration of those different places?
A bit of both. I spent some time on the Westman Islands actually when I was writing it, because I wanted to get a feel for the island, and it hasn't changed very much at all, except there was a big volcano in 1973 that extended part of the east side of it. But apart from that, it's easy to imagine it in the 17th century. And so I walked and I wandered and I imagined my people into these places, living a life of extraordinary poverty. Iceland in the 17th century was probably the poorest nation in Europe at that time. It was a as I've said, it was a colony of Denmark. It wasn't particularly badly treated. It was just ignored, and they They fished. They tried to sell their fish on, but the Danes insisted in being middlemen and giving them very little money in return. So they were very, very poor. So I imagined that into the Westman Islands. And then I did go to Algiers. I was only there for a few days, and there's very little of modern Algiers that is the way it would have been when they arrived there. But there's a little bit of the oldest bit at the top. So I got a guide, and I got him to take me around these streets, and I got him to take me to he entered into the spirit of it. He knew what I was looking for, and he said, I'm going to take you to this lady, a friend of mine, and she's going to cook you some Algerian meals. And and I said, have they changed at all? Are they anything like that? Oh, he said, no, they've never changed. So I was able to imagine, to smell, to smell the food and to see the ingredients, and that brought home for me Oliver Eilsson's memoir, when he talked about going from Iceland, this cold place where really they ate eggs in the spring and puffins and fish. They didn't even grow very much grain. It was a very limited diet. They lived in turf houses, which were very well adapted for the Icelandic climate. They should not be patronized. They're very much like the kind of homes that people were living on in Lewis and Harris and the Highlands at the time. They worked for that climate. But he went to Algiers, and he couldn't believe that people had roofs with flat roofs that you could sleep on. And you could look up at the stars as you were sleeping, and it was such a culture shock in the widest possible sense. So I spent a little bit of time in Algiers just so that I could sense it, and I could feel. I went, as it happens, I went in January, and it was a lovely Mediterranean, balmy, climate in January. And that allowed me to imagine what it would have been like, how hot it would have been in July when they arrived. And so, sorry, to answer your question, it's a mixture of finding out, researching, your facts, and then imagining yourself into what it must have been like for them.
And when you started exploring the story and traveling around the spaces, I was really intrigued how you drew in both the sagas and the story of the Arabian Nights. It was almost as these stories were talking to each other. Did you find yourself looking for parallels or wondering about the relationship between them? Or did they generate ideas, the sagas that you've been told as a child? Or is that not quite...
Yeah, it didn't really come that way round. I suppose what happened was that I had my story. I had my basic story of what happened. And then what you can do as a historical novelist is you can imagine into the spaces that are left. And I have to imagine myself into a man and a woman and their children, indeed, at the beginning of the 17th century in a culture that is so divorced, from my own. What connects? Because in order to write imaginatively and to bring readers into that world, you need to find connection points. So the first connection point is our humanity. My second connection point with Austa, who's the main protagonist, is that she's a woman. And she's a woman who was separated from her children. Any woman today will be able to imagine what that feels like. Giving birth in a ship, any woman who's given birth will know what that feels like. So you imagine all that you can imagine, but it wasn't enough. I needed to build more into Austa to make her live and to make you to be able to identify with her. So I said, I thought to myself, what else would she have? And I thought, she lives in Iceland. She lives in Iceland where they have no entertainment beyond, as indeed in Scotland at the same time, beyond stories. they tell each other stories. And these are stories from the sagas. So in the 16th century, you have the sagas, which are medieval literature. But they were written down, but they were told to each other orally. So everybody knew the sagas. These would be told in these winter evenings when the work couldn't be done and everybody's just sitting huddled around the fire. And there would also be the folklore that is created by what you see when you poke your nose outside the door in Iceland, and you see these grotesque shapes in the lava, and you see, mounds that look as if they were elf mounds. And the folklore grows out of that. And I thought she would have all that in her head. She's also married to a pastor at a time, a Lutheran pastor, at a time when the Lutheran religion in the early 17th century was extremely strict and terrifying in many ways. So she would have all that, and all that kind of mixed up in her brain. And she's suddenly plucked out of everything she's known, this cold, rather barren, homogeneous culture, and she's taken into Algiers. What she's got these stories. And so I wanted stories that keep us going, the stories that allow us to live when everything else is gone, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, which may or may not be true, but they're what allow us to put one step in front of the other when life is difficult. And when she's in Algiers, and then she is beginning to accommodate herself to what she finds there. What does she find there? She finds another culture, it seemed to me, when I began to read a little bit. Not that there was very much that I could read in English, certainly, but she finds a storytelling culture of a different kind. And she begins to enter into that. And when she learns the language, she begins to hear the stories that are coming back. And so it wasn't a literary thing I was really getting at, but more just that human beings are always just the same. That it connects us to the 17th century. It connects Icelanders to Muslims in Algiers. People are the same. But what we've done is build all sorts of, excrescences around it that means that we can't communicate or share or understand each other. And, the process of the novel was her learning about another way of life, another way of thinking. For a Christian in the 17th century, as all of Europe was, Christian civilization, to find yourself in a situation where you're in a Muslim household where your children are immediately, if they're not taken from you, if they're too young to be taken from you, as hers were, the younger ones, then they have to become Muslims. And so she has to watch them becoming Muslims. And that's not just that's an interesting cultural experience for my children, they're becoming Muslims. It's not only will I lose them in this life, I will lose them in the next. We will be separated in eternity because the Muslims are heathens and there's, they're going to be lost. My children will be lost to me for the whole of the extent of eternity. And that is what she's got to deal with in that.
And that's
culture.
a really powerful, if
Yeah.
you know the novel, it's a very powerful moment in the novel of that sort of the tension between those two religious traditions and her heart, her yearning for her children as well. As I was reading it, I started wondering also about you as a mother who tells stories to her children. You've got 5 children. How do you tell stories? Do you read them? Do you make them up?
I'm so very flattered that you think I'm still reading to my children at the age of 35. I don't read to them any longer, obviously, no. But when they were younger, what did I do? I used to read to them. I used to read books to them, and my husband actually, he's the storyteller. He's the one who could always make them up. So he would make up really, really exciting stories, which the children would always want in preference to me saying, "Now let's get out a book here and let's read this." And how? Why is it that Dad can always make up good stories and you can't? And I said, well, I do Willow Wasp. And, Willow Wasp was the only story I ever made up for my children. Why a wasp? I mean, so I read to them, yeah.
What do you say to people who link this book, Sealwoman's Gift, with the plight of refugees today?
What would I say to them?
Yeah.
Well, yes. I wasn't particularly thinking of the modern situation when I was writing, but I think any writer is always, any historical fiction has always got something of the perspective of the person writing it within it, even unconsciously. And I think there are all sorts of ways in which the experience of the Icelanders who became refugees without wanting to, as most refugees, it's the same situation. They were also being sexually trafficked, So there's a lot of modern sort of parallels because basically nothing changes. They were a version. It was trafficking. It was it was the experience of refugees having to leave their home and their culture and be in another culture in which they are. In their cases, they weren't wanted in a particular kind of way, but the feeling of not being wanted where you arrive and having to accommodate yourself. And then I became very interested. I'm always interested, actually, in what happens after. There's a story, and then there's what happens when the story ends, sort of thing, and what happens when you go back. When you experience all that, and then you find that you're back in the culture where you started, but you're different. You are bound to be different because of what that experience has done to you. And then you find that you haven't got a place that you're comfortable in anywhere, because the person you are now is no longer able to be the person you were 10 years ago in that same culture. You've got nowhere. And I often wonder that. I wonder that about the Syrians today, if they got a chance to go back, what it would be like. It's hard.
Let's move to your second novel, from the 17th century into the 19th century, and I'm wondering why you chose this story and what drew you towards the whole. You tell us about the story, because it's an incredible tale.
Well, it's based. The Loch Katrine waterworks and the wonderful, wonderful engineering works that were built in the 1850s to provide pure Highland water for Glasgow, which was suffering as most of all of the major cities in Britain were at that time from repeated epidemics of cholera, which it was discovered earlier in Scotland than in England was due to or carried in polluted water. And I've always been interested in this. We live not very far from what is now Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, and you can see these magnificent, the sluices, the tunnels, the aqueducts. It's fantastic Victorian engineering, described at the time as the most brilliant piece of engineering since the aqueducts of Rome. And it was, it's on my doorstep virtually. And the reason I write I mean, I like the exercise of putting words together and making it as elegant as possible on the one hand, but the real reason I write is because I'm interested enough in something to want to find out more. So I'd always been interested in the waterworks, and when I was due to write another book, I thought, if I set it in Loch Catron, or Loch On, round about there, I could allow myself to go and find out all about that waterworks, how it happened, you know, what the problems were about building it, and then the literary challenge. How do you make a book about engineering interesting? And then, you know, one of the ways in which you make a book about engineering interesting is you make it about more than engineering, and what else could it be about? And that's when I brought in a character called Robert Kirk, who just geographically, it's only about 10 miles along the road, Aberfoyle, from Loch Catron, and he's a character and a half. He's another, it so happens, it's completely coincidental, but it so happens that he is also a pastor, if you like, in the 17th century. He was a minister in Balquhidder and then in Aberfoyle at the end of the 17th century. And he was a wonderful character who was very interested in the fairies, interested in his parishioners' pre-Christian beliefs in folklore and fairies and all sorts of other things. And because of that, he got a bit of a reputation for being odd. And when he died, up on Doonhill in Aberfoyle, he was, legend grew up that he had been snatched by the fairies because they were fed up with him poking into their business. And he was called, after that, the fairy minister. He owes this to Sir Walter Scott, who, you know, thought it was a great story and popularized it. And the story was that he was imprisoned by the fairies, and he did get out at one point, but he had to go back again. And the poor man who led a blameless existence has gone down in history as this chap who was stolen by the fairies. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if, while the great excavations were going on for the tunnel at Loch Catron, the earth that contained fairy, which was what Robert Kirk wrote about in his Secret Commonwealth. He himself thought that it might be possible that you had heaven there and you had earth there, and underneath you had the secret commonwealth of the fairies living underneath. So I thought, well, take it seriously. Let's just take his thoughts seriously, take the legend seriously, and see what happens if he comes back in the 1850s when the Loch Catron waterworks are being built. And then, of course, I gave myself the horrendous problem of how do you marry a serious historical book with social realities that are actually, because it's about the role of women in the 19th century. It's about miscarriage, it's about cholera, and it's about engineering. It's all true. Well, not that, there's fictional characters there, but it's socially true. How do you marry that with a legend about a man who appears 150 years after he's been born and has made a bargain with fairies? So only you can judge whether I succeeded. But
I thought it was really striking how you brought together 19th century engineering, the whole world of sort of scientific, and it's an incredible endeavour to have done what they did. And then alongside the Highland tradition of the fairies, bringing those together. And earlier today we had at a festival here, Marina Warner, one of the experts on fairy tales, and she was reflecting on fairy tales and was arguing that it's really important to understand fairy tales because they tell us something about our place as well, our cultural context, our world, our worldview. And I wonder, what do you think these stories of fairies have got to teach us now, 21st century?
Gosh, you're asking quite difficult questions.
You can ignore them. You can make your own question.
I don't know. To be honest, I do not know what the fairies have got to teach us in the 21st century. That I do not know. What I do know is that we have always, as human beings, we have always reached for the supernatural in order to be able to explain the things that we do not understand, so that we don't now think that fairies steal babies and replace them with changelings. We don't think that because we understand that babies may be born with deformities, that babies can have illnesses for the following reasons. So we don't need to believe in fairies to understand. We need to understand things because life is terribly, terribly difficult. And it was very, very difficult then. And things were happening that they had no understanding of. And things happen to us today that we've got no understanding of, but we don't reach. I don't think, I don't know what Marina Warner obviously studies this and thinks about it a great deal more than I do. I don't think that we reach particularly to fairies today for that, but I think it was tremendously important then. And what I was trying to do actually in The Ninth Child was trying to suggest that, trying to use where I chose geographically to suggest a sort of collision between the ancient beliefs, which are all over the place in the Trossachs. If anybody knows that area, the place names in Gaelic are all about fairies, all about these experiences that people were having when they were naming the rocks and the lochans and the hills. They've all got fairy names. The collision between that and the modernity of the time, which was this great sort of engineering, and I was kind of trying to use the place to play with these concepts and to use the fairy not just as a silly idea. Of course, on one level it's completely silly, but on another, I think that writers can use ancient things like Robert Louis Stevenson and James Hogg and James Robertson, indeed, is another writer who does this today, who takes these ancient beliefs and uses them to explore psychology, the psychology of the self, the duality of the psyche, if you like, these parts of ourselves that are always in battle inside our human selves between, good and evil, if you want to give it that sort of expression, but between selfishness and what you think you probably should be doing, what you tell yourself you are doing for certain reasons when actually you're not. What's going on in your head is actually something that you're not acknowledging. All that sort of thing can be I thought could be dramatized through Robert Kirk, having made his bargain with fairy. And I was borrowing, some of the ideas of James Hogg in that as well, so that the voices that Robert Kirk is hearing, which are hammering away at him all the time. I wanted to dramatize this idea of good and evil within the human condition, and the fact that what he's fighting for in the end is to find his humanity back again.
Thank you. Shall we move on? Let's move on to Where Memories Go. This was a global hit, and why do you think it? It sold thousands, hundreds of thousands of copies, and caused ripples around the world, really. And I'm interested to hear your reflections on that phenomenon. I mean, did it surprise you, that impact it had?
Yes and no. I mean, it's always surprising, and it's always surprising that anybody reads anything you write at all. So on that level, you're always terribly gratified if anybody buys a single book. But at another level, I knew that this was something that so many people go through. So many families have dementia in their lives and have to deal with it. And it was even more in 2014 when I wrote this, it was even more hidden than it is now. I mean, we do talk about it now. But it was at that time, the stigma of it was still quite powerful. And I had, this is a book, in case people don't know, it's just the story of my mother's dementia over a number of years, and the loneliness of trying to deal with that experience when the social and healthcare props were just not there, completely inadequate, as they still are, indeed, maybe slightly less so. And as I wrote, I was writing really for myself to start with, but as I wrote, I began to get a sense that I could, by finding ways of articulating our experience, I could perhaps just help a little bit for others who were in the same situation and would get comfort from reading that other people had found the system impossible to navigate. Other people had lost their tempers with the person that they love so dearly, and that is what happened in the end. That people did respond to that in that way, and that's, I think, why it became so popular.
I mean, I found it a deeply passionate book that actually reduced me to tears on several occasions. And I was thinking back over, I've only recently revisited it and found it very affecting. And I suppose that's me just listening to the story. And I suppose it made me wonder about your mother as a storyteller.
Yeah.
And was she a storyteller who would captivate an audience? Would she captivate small groups, large groups? Was she she was obviously a limerick teller as well. You brought her, I mean, so alive that I wanted to meet her and felt sad I hadn't met her.
Yeah, no, she was. She was very good at telling stories. She was very funny, very funny, and she had lots and lots of anecdotes about her, her early journalistic days and her family life, and yes, she had to write limericks because she went to write for the Sunday Post after she left school, and her job was at one point was to write a limerick every week for the Sunday Post. We're not talking very hard news here, and these limericks, I heard them so often that I can probably trot them off myself. Although I was thinking just the other day, actually they're quite politically incorrect. My favourite one is, I've just realised, is about domestic abuse, but it's not how she. It was there was a wee fella from Yoker hit his wife as she slept with a poker. When charged with assault, he said, "It's no my fault. I thought that wee bang would have woke her." It suddenly went through my head the other day, and I thought, my goodness, you can't make fun of this any longer. Yeah. But that's the kind of material, anyway, that she was coming up with. So she was good. She was funny.
And the part of the power of the book for me reading it was this reversal of this amazing storyteller, this charismatic, funny, warm, loving figure who had cared for you and your sisters, and then it's the reversal so that you are then becoming her carer.
Yeah.
And I suppose thinking about that was as you wrote that story, and I know it's some years now since you wrote it. As you wrote that, did you find yourself revisiting in both joyful and painful places in a way that made you look at them differently?
Sorry, what?
Okay, no, sorry, that's probably not a very good question. Let's try. I think I'm wondering about the anguish that clearly comes out of the book of you as the reversal of roles.
Yeah.
The reversal of roles,
Yeah.
and what that made you think as you were going through it, but also as you were writing about it.
Well, I was writing about it as I was going through it.
Okay.
Because
yeah.
it was written sort of as a diary. So there wasn't. It wasn't that there was anguish later, as it were. I was trying to kind of express it in the immediacy of the present, and it was virtually. It was really done as a diary. But yes, I mean, if you're asking about the experience of finding that you're mothering your mother, is one that I mean, actually, I think now it is actually the natural order of things in a curious kind of way. It doesn't feel natural at the time to begin to become the parent of your parents, and the dementia experience makes it much more intense and sort of horrific. But I've got to the age now where my own children start to feel that they need to parent me, and it's clearly just what happens, and I'm trying to sort of accept this as graciously as possible. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard going. Yeah.
Would you like to read just that short passage we were talking about
Oh, yeah.
earlier?
Yeah, okay.
Which I think is here. From, I don't know, you want to put it in context? Because this captures part of the reversal.
This is a bit, towards the end. I think it was the last Christmas that we had together, and my mother, by that time, was far into the dementia experience. And that night, it was Christmas Eve, and we celebrate the Icelandic Christmas, and I went over to her house. She lived just along the road from us, so I saw a lot of her, and I was there a lot. But my sister had come up for Christmas, and she was staying with her, and so I had been away for 2 or 3 days. I hadn't seen her, and in that time, instead of seeing her every day, there had been 3 days apart, and I came back, and she didn't recognize me. And it was the first time she'd ever not recognized me, but also she was hostile. And that's what I found so very hard. It was, I leant over to kiss her, and she said, "Take your hands off me, what do you think you're doing?" And it was horrible. And I went back to my house, and we had our Christmas Eve dinner, and all the kids went to bed, and I sat downstairs in this cold, quiet house in the early hours of Christmas morning, just thinking to myself, how can it be? How can it be that this woman who I know has loved me all my life doesn't love me now? And how can I accommodate this in my brain? Do I have to tell myself that she's somebody different, that she has become somebody different? But I don't want her to be somebody different. I want her to be who she is. And so this is the bit, I think if I can find it, this is the bit where I sort of try and work that through to something that in the end helped me. So I'd gone into my desk and found a letter when she'd written to me years before, telling me how much she loved me. I read the letter through, trying to remind myself of what the deepest places of your heart look like. I have a sudden impulse to rush around the house, waking up those 5 grown-up children of mine, all gathered under one roof for Christmas, to impress on them the most important thing they can ever know about their own mother.
at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's an urge they can be thankful I resist. But I want them to know that what is in my own heart for them at this moment is me, the essence of me, the shiny pearl, the heart of my mystery, as Hamlet put it. I don't care if I'm imagining such a pearl. I want them to believe in it and to keep it for me. Does this make any kind of sense, Mum? I'm asking them to believe that if this disease should one day hunt me down, and for all I know, it's skulking under the lamppost already, if it should ever cause me to stare into their eyes with the icy dislike I saw in yours, it comes from a diseased brain and not from the place I will call my soul, which is theirs forever. And thinking about what I feel for them, I understand you. This is the moment, clutching a thin blue sheet of Basildon Bond notepaper in a cold house in the early hours of Christmas morning, that I realize it's the same for you. Whether or not I ever see another sign of it, you love me. Of course you do. Brain experts may shake their heads, but I don't care. This is heart sense. I have your own pearl safe in my possession. You are you. On the afternoon of Christmas Day, I return to your house, prepared for anything. I'm told you've been agitated all afternoon, tearful, easily annoyed and upset. Never mind, I'm ready. I stand outside the room and check my armor nervously. Jeans and scrubbed face, check. It's because I'd been wearing a party dress the day before and I don't think she recognized that. Breezy but calm demeanor, check. Quiet smile, no hint of an assumed familiarity that might spook you, check. I open the door. You're sitting in exactly the same place in front of the fire as yesterday. You look up, catch sight of me, and smile. It's a weak, worn affair, but there's no mistaking its meaning. You recognize me. Approaching carefully as if you were a frightened deer in danger of bolting, I slide lightly onto the arm of your chair. You tolerate it. Softly, slowly, I reach out to stroke your hair. You lean back and close your eyes. You feel for my hand. Oh no, I'm crying again. All that armor useless because I never thought to protect myself against this. Later, I sit curled at your feet and look into your eyes. You quite like me today, don't you? You gaze down at me, eyes clear and warm. I love you. Outside, the wind howls and rain pelts the dark window. We sit together listening to it, catching the moment as it flies. You know me not. It really does not matter. I know you. And that's what kind of helped.
Listening to that again makes me think we're hearing almost it's like a love story. And in a way, each of those books, the two novels and this biography, they're kind of love stories in different ways, with strong, independent women at the heart of them. How far do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's quite true, actually, yeah.
They're love stories. Anyway, I've got lots more questions, but I'm going to stop there because I'd love to hear. I'm sure there are lots of questions from the floor. So we have a roving mic for any questions to Sally. Yes, I think there's a gentleman here, and the mic is coming towards us now. That's great. Yeah, just take it through. Thank you. If we can wait for the mic, because you do take your mask off if you want for the question, please. Yeah, it's just through there. Just there. Thanks. Thanks, Aoife. That's great.
Thank you very much. Is it on?
Yeah.
Yes. On. Okay. To lighten the tone a bit after that very moving passage you read, and I have read that book, going back to the question you were asked about fairies and what truth they have to tell us today, I want to say it's very simple. If you've ever seen Peter Pan, Tinker Bell asks the audience very distinctly, if you believe in fairies, you know what you have to do, right? Is it ringing the bell? And that keeps the fairies alive. That's the point I want to make.
Thank you. Another question from Elsbeth there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is also, I apologise, not really a question. It's also an audio idea, kind of connected with your work for Playlist for Life, which helps people to think about songs that will evoke important moments in somebody's life, and to do that work before it becomes difficult to do that. And it just made me wonder what it would be like to have a theme tune, so that when you came into a room, the person would know that it was you, which is a bit like ringing a bell and, you know, believing in fairies, but somehow to kind of have recourse to other than the sort of visual language of familiarity,
Sorry,
yeah.
do you mean that if I walked into your room, my music would be playing?
Yes, but it would have to be music that would relate in, you know, that would be part of the language of our relationship. So if you had a theme tune that your mum recognised, it could potentially, you know, trigger memories and be a comforting thing and prevent those sort of traumatic episodes of feeling not recognised, or you know, to use music. I don't know how it would work. It might be some kind of clever app with GPS something. And again, it's not a question. It's just a.
No, so it's very interesting, and you're drawing attention to something that is terribly important, which is that music that is tremendously personal in whatever way it is an amazingly evocative way of helping to stimulate the memory of the person who's listening to it.
If it is a question, it's about the relationship between Playlist for Life and this book. Which came first?
Well, yes, it was slightly different. The book came first, but it was actually published after Playlist for Life had been started. But Playlist for Life grew out of the experience with my mother that I was writing about at the time. And when she, and I talk a little bit in the book about the effect that music had on her. It became the latterly almost the only way in which we could communicate with her, and it brought her to herself almost every time in the most wonderful ways. It was almost, by the end of it, it was like sort of switching on a light. And when she died, I started to think to myself, you know, this is amazing. I wonder whether we were just lucky here, you know, that we knew a lot of the songs that she had loved, and we were able to sing them with her. Or is this a universal phenomenon? And I started to research music and the mind, and I went to New York to visit a place run by Oliver Sacks, and Oliver Sacks himself wasn't there at the time, but Connie Tomeno, who he was working with in a big care home in the Bronx, and she's a music therapist, and they were investigating the extent to which music could help people suffering from dementia to sort of reconnect with themselves. And she encouraged me. She said, "You're onto something here. We're seeing it in our work." And I found a chap who was offering music to people in care homes on iPods, as it was at the time. It's funny how we don't have iPods any longer. They were the big thing then. And I came back to Britain, and I decided to start it here and see if I could get a charity going here that would go into care homes and help people to find themselves through music.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry to be boring, but mine is just a straightforward question. In what ways, if any, do you bring your journalistic tradition or disciplines to bear on writing fiction? Are there any sort of ways that you approach the writing of fiction that may be specific to someone with a journalistic background, in ways which people who don't have that might come at it from a different angle?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. It really is, because I think for a long time my journalistic background actually inhibited me when I was writing the Sealwoman's Gift, because contrary to what many people think, journalists generally try not to make things up. And you have, when you're as long in the tooth as me, you've had quite a number of decades of very deliberately not making things up and checking everything and being absolutely sure if you write anything that nobody could stand up and say this didn't happen, or, And I wrote my first draft of the Sealwoman's Gift, and I got to the end of it, and I thought, this is boring. And then I thought, oh, no, you're too close to it, Sally. It's all right. And sent it off to my editor. And the editor said, Sally, this is boring. She didn't quite, but, And she said, you just need to inhabit the characters. And she said, maybe it's time to put the research away. And I realized that that's exactly what I needed to do. I needed to stop thinking as a journalist. I needed to stop writing as if, in the case of the Sealwoman's Gift, there was an Icelandic professor that I had gone to interview. He had written the seminal book about the Turkish raid, and I had got lots and lots of information from him. And I realized, I've written this book for him. I want Professor Thorstensson to look at it and think, gosh, Sally Magnusson, fancy her knowing that. And, completely the wrong attitude. And I conceived an image for myself, which was that I was up a tree and I had to set off and fly out of that tree and not think that I would fall. I mean, it's a sort of silly idea, but it just helped me. And what I had been doing was to always be thinking about the ground and how I could get myself back to the ground and my safety, my comfort zone of facts, and I had to start imagining. And that was really hard. And as I was saying earlier, I was the one in our marital partnership who didn't do the storytelling, who didn't do the imagining, and I had to do this. And I thought, I can't do this. I've never, I became a reporter for a reason, and it's because that's what I do. I report. I don't imagine. And unfortunately, by that time, I had signed a contract and I had an editor waiting for a book, and I jolly well had to imagine. And I kind of did. I mean, there were a few more drafts to go after that until I really found my rhythm. And with the ninth child, as you can see with the themes of the ninth child, I've gone even further from my journalistic roots, and I'm allowing myself to imagine fairies and all, and all sorts of things. And the one that I'm working on now, my third novel, I'm even more so. I did a lot of research to start with, just so I understood, because you've got to have historical authenticity. But then I just put it away and have written from inside, and it's given a different sort of flavor.
Can you tell us more about that novel?
Not very much. No. But it's a married couple spending one night together 40 years after something very important happened
to them both. And they are they're going through a night together and remembering, I suppose, in effect, is what they're doing, but also kind of interacting and so I'm operating on a lot of different time zones. I'm always trying to make it more difficult for myself. I don't want to do the same thing twice. I want to try and stretch myself in the craft and so on. So it's a slightly different one. This.
Thank you. Another question. Over there, if that's... Thanks, Eva.
I have a question that's going back to dementia, and that would be to ask, if you had a magic wand and all the funds in the world, what would you want, what would be your first priority for people living with dementia and those who are caring for them?
Oh gosh. A care system that is based on individuals. I think dementia is an illness, first of all. Therefore, it should be treated, not medicalized, but it should be given the dignity of being treated as an illness, along with every other illness. But it should also, the difficulty about it, and the reason why it hasn't been, why it's been sort of dumped in sort of social care, is because every person who has this illness is different. It manifests itself so differently in all sorts of people. I mean, dementia itself, we now realize, is not, there's the main ones like Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia and 2 or 3 others that we have names for, but arguably there's hundreds of different forms. Therefore, everybody has to be treated individually. And so, since we're talking magic here, it would be a care system in which every single person was listened to and understood and then cared for consistently and lovingly every single day of their lives till the end, in the place where they most wanted to be, with the people they most wanted to be with lots of music, with lots of joy, with lots of continuing expectations of them, to allow people to continue to live the fullest possible lives for as long as possible, which is a lot longer, I think, than many are able to do because of the current constraints. So that's not a very specific picture, but that would be what I would long for in a magic world.
Any other questions? This gentleman over there, just in the...
Thank you so much. Forgive me, I have not read your books, but reflecting on what you've said so far, my father passed this past year, and so I'm doing a lot of reflection on loss. And how important is it? I'm sorry, forgive me. It's so easy to try to continue in the process by forgetting, by deflecting. And we want to draw to those memories of the joy. How important is it to lean into the pain, the process of losing? I guess it's probably not a really well-formed question, but looking at the whole of someone's life, it's so easy to gravitate to the happy times. How important is it to really lean into the messiness of life and the pain of who you've lost in the process of it?
Are you saying you find it easy to gravitate to the happy times?
I think it's easier at times, but even sometimes gravitating to the happy times, it brings pain.
Yeah.
Of that deep sense of loss.
Yeah.
Recently, someone I was listening to said something along the lines of, the pain is a reminder of the love that was there. And so, yeah, it's, I guess, just thinking through a lot of what it means to process and to come to terms, whatever process means, with loved ones you've lost. Yeah, is it okay just to, I don't know, just continue in the pain, and to lean into that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm no counselor. I think grief is a part of life, and I think if you lose somebody like your dad that you're very, very close to, there is pain that you have to go through, and I think there are no, with loss of any sort, I don't think there's any quick or glib answers or ways out. But I think if you are able to access the happy times, you should go there as often as you can, because I think that's wonderful. My horror when my mother died was, I thought, what if I can't get back to the happiest times, because my head was so full of how very difficult it was towards the end. And I thought, I don't want to remember this stuff. I want to get back to the other, and maybe I never will be able to. And the lovely thing was that as time passed, I was able to, and that when I think about her now, I think about joyous times. I don't know what to say to you except it's hard. It's it's painful. But it sounds to me as if you've had a great love there, and that man will live with you and continue to influence you, and continue to sort of be part of your footsteps as you go forward, and eventually it won't be so painful. Best I can do. Sorry.
No, I appreciate it.
One last question, Judith. One last question, just to Judith here in the front row.
I just wondered, in the terms of coming to terms with what you were going through with your mother, do you think that actually being a writer, a journalist as well as being a creative writer, a writer of fiction, was actually cathartic for you, because you were journaling the journey that you were on? And I've often thought that when we go through really difficult times, to be able to write is a gift. And I wonder if you would say to all of us here, just start writing when you're going through a difficult time, because there might be something that will be healing in that, and a time when you might be able to go back as well and know what it was like. And
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that with the gentleman over here, it might even be something that you could do. Begin to write some stuff. Begin to write what comes to you when you think about your dad, and find some kind of sort of accommodation with your grief that way. I absolutely agree with you. I wrote this. In fact, I write it, I think, at the beginning, that the reason that I wrote was to try and hold on to my mother in words. She was, she was beginning to change in different ways, and I wanted to hold on to each stage. And so I would watch her. I would watch the way she combed her hair, and the way she put her lipstick on, and think, there'll be a time when I can't watch this, therefore I really want to watch it now, and I want to try and write down, and I wanted to try and describe her smile, and try and describe her way of talking, her way of telling a story, and that enabled me, I think, to hold on to these bits as we were going along. And I think the other thing that writing can do is it helps you to put a shape on experience that is formless and chaotic and ungraspable. and that you feel out of control, and you can write to give a certain kind of form that helps you through it, I think. Yeah, so absolutely. You want me to say everybody should write? Yes, I think so. I think it's,
That's what I wanted.
I think it's a great idea. And nobody needs ever to see what you write, you know, in the end of the day.
There is so much more that I'd like to ask, and I'm sure there are many other questions and comments that could come now from the floor, but sadly we should pause here. But can I say on behalf of us all a huge thank you to Sally for answering our questions with such grace and sensitivity and thoughtfulness and openness and vulnerability. Thank you also for these beautiful books, which I'm delighted to recommend to you. They're in the Rainey Hall on sale, and Sally's kindly agreed to sign them if that's okay. The Sealwoman's Gift and also The Ninth Child. This book, Where Memories Go, is not current. It is available, but I think they're reprinting, so there aren't copies there, but I think you can get it online eventually. But I do recommend those books. I'm looking forward to your third book. Can I say also thank you to each of you for coming tonight. Thank you for your wonderful questions and your attentive listening as well. Do come back in 45 minutes or so and join Sarah Parvis in conversation with Francis Spufford. This is one of a number of books that he's written. Wonderful book, nominated Booker Prize, like Perpetual. I recommend that book to you as well. But that session starts at 8:45. Sorry, not at 9, at 8:45. There's drinks, tea, hot coffee, hot tea and wine next door as well. So please stay on for reception if you have time. But can I invite you all to join me in saying a huge thank you to Sally. Thank you.